as we do this program on Thursdays live here at the YouTube channel. I just want to, before I get started here, I want to make note of some developments that I'm not yet, regarding my show, that I'm not yet able to confirm, so I'm not going to mention details. But it does appear that it's likely that my program is going to be picked up by a network that is not going to censor me. And I'm going to do the program there exclusively. And if that happens, I will be making very brief programming on YouTube just to announce where to see the program and who my guests may be. Because, I feel very nervous still about YouTube. I'm tired and sick and tired of the censorship there. I suppose in a broad sense, they have a right to do it technically. But I would simply note that as someone who's been a radio talk show host in the greater Boston area off and on for the last 15 years, and who has worked at many small market stations in the greater Boston area. And these are brick and mortar stations where I've gone there and I've done a broadcast, and there are people there, that I work with. I understand what community standards are. And I understand the difference between community standards and political censorship. And what I'm dealing with on YouTube and in TikTok and a couple of other networks, I would suggest is political censorship. And even in that context, I have a good understanding of parameters. And, I do self-censor. I know where to go and not go in terms of what's appropriate for an audience or what is true. I'm very careful about that. So I feel that YouTube is censoring me. There is a radio host in Buffalo, New York, I'm not going to mention who has a pretty big show and who, adheres to FDA regulations, as did I, but yet he's been censored from YouTube for the same commentary that he's engaged in on his show. So that to me is just one more piece of evidence, not that I need too many, to show that the stations are, that the big tech is censoring information. It's not censoring community standards. So for that reason, I am trying to go on to this other network, and it is made up of people, journalists, some of whom I may agree with, some of whom I may not agree with. But at least they're courageous enough to investigate stories, and that's exactly what I want to do. So, Doovid, what's up with you?
Yeah, great. I hope that's successful.
I'll let you know.
But so if we want to keep on doing the partners in Torah, I guess, on the new network, or if that's not for your thing, we could do it, on your YouTube or.
Nothing will change. I mean, and I don't know if I'll be doing it through Zoom or through, they might have some, modality, whatever it is, the show goes on.
I mean, just a quick thought on that, because we've discussed this in the past quite a few times, I guess, Judeo-Christian differences and the role of hypocrisy is one of the largest long stretch complaints against Judaism is hypocrisy from the New Testament till Kant and you may be on the right wing today. And from some extent, I've tried to own that and say, yes, according to Judaism, hypocrisy is not really a sin at all. In fact, the fake it till you make it could say is such your Judeo. Ask any rabbi and he'll tell you, yes, fake it till you make it, in the sense that hypocrisy is certainly not a heavy sin, but in terms of the platforms, it's this bait and switch hypocrisy where if they just told you that they want to have their own private network in order to do their own private thing, it would be one thing. But they purposely portray themselves in a way that is not accurate to how they are, and it's basically all a big bait and switch. Like everybody's welcome, every point of view,
Right, sure.
And then once you get there, it's like, no, that's not the case. And so it's like, okay, we didn't pay them anything, and beggars can't be choosers. But it's the hypocrisy nature of I'm not sure if you agreed with me that to kind of own the anti-Semitic trope and say, yeah, I mean, hypocrisy and factually is not a big deal according to Judaism. If there's no damage, if you portray yourself in a way that you're not, and it steals from somebody, then hypocrisy is not the sin. Stealing is the sin, and hypocrisy was just the vehicle someone used to steal. But hypocrisy in and of itself is not really a big deal. And it's kind of the question, like, shaving for business, or these various factors where Judaism, we're supposed to be successful, and if kind of tricking people into thinking that you're better than you actually are is really not that bad of a thing. And then possibly compared to a Christian conception where hypocrisy, it's more like a belief where action isn't the key thing, but belief is the key thing, and where hypocrisy becomes a high crime. So like, the hypocrisy doesn't surprise me.
Mhm.
And if you're in the radio business, it's a tough business, and you got to be on top of these switching platforms, and you're working together with people, and you're working together with people where there's really not much long-term hope in doing it, because you would see that they don't have your best interests in mind, and they are going to change the rules on you. And if it's your livelihood, it's not going to be stable with any of these given services.
No. Well, Doovid, this is a complex question regarding hypocrisy. I mean, I suppose that hypocrisy can be wrong once you're aware of hypocrisy, but we all engage in various hypocrisies every day. I mean, it's just there are things that we do that aren't necessarily consonant with things that we say or things that we believe. And I suppose in a broad sense, what comes to my mind is that, let's say you're applying for a job, or you're applying at a college to get in, or whatever it might be. You might embellish a little bit. You might pad the resume, not outright lying, which is not what I'm talking about, but anyone will tell you that when you
Purposely portray yourself to be significantly better
when you step out the
than you
door
actually
every
are.
day. That's right. I mean, anyone, regardless, when you step out the door every day, you tend to want to put your better foot forward and emphasize that, and maybe put away the bad stuff, something that doesn't look as good, that's not as helpful. You might kind of put that sort of in the shadow. That's normal. That's natural. But the question of hypocrisy within Judaism, I don't know. I mean, I'd like you to maybe elaborate a little bit on that, because I don't get that. I mean, we believe in what we believe in. I don't know if it's hypocritical.
Well, I mean, from a lot of our practices, we're, so to say, bending the truth. And I'm trying to draw a line from
Excuse me.
the New Testament critique about Pharisees, and us being in the synagogues pretending like we're righteous, when reality, God forbid, we're not. To Kant, saying that truth, to the later criticisms of Kant and modern day, probably even conservatives, that we have a utilitarian view towards truth, as opposed towards an absolute view towards truth, and that there's some sort of utilitarian outlook on what does truth lead to, in the sense most likely seen through business practices. Like, is it okay to use a Gentile Anglo name as a Jew in order to get ahead in business practices? And is it okay to all sorts of things where generally say yes, and maybe it's even recommended. If you asked your rabbi would tell you should do what you have to do to get ahead. And the devising line would be if there's damages. So, okay, like,
Right.
I'm not a licensed engineer. I did a year in University of Michigan civil engineering school, unmatriculated. I frequently call myself an engineer, and really, like, what am I? I'm a landlord, but I like to call myself an engineer. And maybe someone misled, maybe someone would do business with me, and if they had looked into it, they wouldn't. God forbid, my grandfather, my Jewish grandfather, World War II veteran, used to lie about having a university degree, and he did not have a university degree. Education, was very important. All his kids went on to become highly educated, but he lied and told people he had a college degree. when he didn't. And if you call that a form of hypocrisy, and just like, okay, like, me or you, we're not Orthodox Jews. We call ourselves Orthodox Jews. We say, like, you're a hypocrite. You're not really an Orthodox Jew. You don't really do all this stuff that is dependent on being an Orthodox Jew, to where it's no big deal. It's not even like within Judaism, it's not even not even a question of sin, just to kind of like talk a big game. It's a question of damages. If I say I'm an engineer and then I take a business that is out of my range and it causes monetary loss towards the person who, so to say, believes my lie, then there's damages, and then there's a penalty to hypocrisy. But like generally, kind of like like finagle, like, even like I tricked the goy, God forbid, I made the person believe something that wasn't true, and then there was a utilitarian benefit towards truth, because like in the end, it didn't really matter that I'm not a licensed engineer. I didn't need to sign or forge a document.
Well, it might matter.
And or whatever the case
is. It doesn't
is.
matter for little things. I mean, in the course of a day, even though I don't think it's a good idea, it shouldn't be done. I mean, if you can avoid it, but we all kind of sometimes will do little embellishments, I mean, in the course of a day, just to get through things. But
within Judaism, it could even be recommended. Like if you asked your rabbi,
well, to save a life,
and you say like, well, I was saying, because the Torah is meant to live by. So not just in terms to save a life, but for business prosperity. And if you call it like white lies, and I mean, this is most foreseen in the Kant critique, and I guess Kant had lost an essay contest against Moses Mendelssohn, but his critique of Judaism is kind of like Richard Spencer and Nietzsche, that we have a utilitarian view towards truth, and we're willing to bend the truth and kind of say, well, what's the purpose? And like the truth is what's ever good for the Jews, and that might be a little too far of a bent, that like it's not whatever true is whatever is best for the Jews, but we're willing to
that can be dangerous.
bend truth a little bit in order to look at for a utilitarian purpose, as opposed to Kant, who want to be absolute about the truth, and possibly like a German rationalist critique of Judaism, which really is a mirror of the Old Testament, of the New Testament, Jesus' critique of the frequent, I think, calling us hypocrites, the most common, slur in the New Testament. And I spoke with Luke Ford at length of this, and say, is this something we could kind of own as a stereotype? They say, yes, you should self-embellish yourself in order to make yourself look better than you actually are.
Well, there's a difference,
and it's not a bad thing, it's a good thing.
No, but
if someone calls you a hypocrite, if you didn't steal from them, if you didn't damage them, it's like no harm done. It was a good thing, not a bad thing.
Yeah, but there's a difference between maybe a little self-embellishment, and I think that even in that context, there are limits.
And then we put that back to YouTube, where YouTube is
for example,
they're claiming to be all this and that, and free speech and this and that, but like no, in reality, they're trying to make money, and they're trying to advance their own agenda, and anything else that they say is just what they're saying in the form of hypocrisy.
When people claim, well, we don't have any political beliefs or political agendas, I usually take a pretty jaundiced eye to that, because they do. And and there's a fine line between, some minor examples of embellishing your name and, really outright lying. I mean, I don't think that, you say, well, it's bad for the Jews. I mean, first of all, does that mean you protect a criminal, a murderer, because they happen to be a Jew? Because you're afraid that it might hurt. There is that tendency, I think, when you get to both very religious circles and also highly secular circles, which are highly political. And in a broad sense, that's a microcosm for any group that is highly political. They will tend to circle the wagons and protect and outright lie in order to reduce scandals, because they believe it could hurt their entire body. And I would argue that it probably wouldn't if they told the truth. If anything, it probably would enhance it. And then you have politicians who will, embellish and lie in order to enhance their record. I mean, it happens all the time. I think of the senator from Connecticut, Blumenthal, who lied about his military record. He had none. He said he was in Vietnam for years. That to me goes to a character flaw, to put it mildly. Maybe he didn't do anything illegal, but it gets to basic, character of a person. If you cross a line and you're outright lying in order to improve your image or in order to get an unfair advantage. And
since we're talking about it, put it straight to you.
Judaism.
I mean, you're a broadcaster, and the typical, so to say, basic hypocrisy would be claiming that your numbers or your reach is bigger, or that your network is more important, your ability to help
Right.
somebody in politics. You say, look, you'll extreme, like I have a good network, I have good views, I'm going to be able to, it's going to be worth your while. And as opposed to say like, nah, I'm really a nobody, only a handful of people watch me. Really, it's not going to benefit you to come on my program.
By the way, Doovid, I have a note here from somebody at TikTok. Mexican matzo ball soup exists, they tell me. Not many know about it. Underground recipe. Joy, please send it. I'd love to see that. I like Mexican food, and I like matzo balls.
I'm saying like YouTube, like of course, all of these freemium type platforms that they're not going to tell you that we have some sort of selective program where our main goal is to make money and advance our agenda and social programming. And we'll let you on a temporary basis, dependent on how much money you help us make and how well you advance our social agenda. They're going to make it look like they're doing some sort of altruistic deed for humanity.
This is true, and I mean any like particularly leftist groups. I mean, I'm not saying it doesn't exist on the right and amongst religious people, but in the service of what they believe is some kind of a greater good, which is their own power, they're absolutely willing to lie, and they've stated it quite honestly. I mean,
we call that kosher hypocrisy to us. Yeah. What's kosher hypocrisy to the non-kosher hypocrisy?
It is
like I was hoping that
it's okay to deceive if it means you're promoting something that you've decided is a greater good, and that includes. There's a certain amount of lying that nations do in order to get people to agree to pay taxes or to go to war or to do other things that are odious and not in their own interest, right? I mean, there's lies. I think you could look at probably every war in history, and there's a certain amount of lying going on, a certain amount of governments using their official position and power to promote a particular narrative that gets people, that is an excuse to invade a country, and that gets people to go to war. I mean, some obvious examples in American history would be the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, 1965. It never happened. Or the Lusitania, the sinking of the Lusitania, which triggered World War I. It was not honest. I mean, they did have huge armaments in that ship, and the Germans had warned the Americans about that. They took out ads in the New York Times complaining about it. So, these were, and that came out in the 1950s. It took about, 40, 30 years before the truth came out. There are lies that happen all the time when when a government in particular, or anyone in power, is trying to get an unfair advantage or trying to get people to do something. Edward Bernays, the nephew of Sigmund Freud, was the author of a book called Propaganda. He's considered to be the father of American public relations. And he talks about this in that book, how to get women to smoke cigarettes. There's a certain marketing thing where they present things in a certain way that's not exactly honest. How do you get people to drink Coca-Cola? I mean, there's a certain amount, I wouldn't say outright lies, but there are certain degrees of deception that can go on when you're trying to get some kind of an advantage, whether it be in the private or public sector. Of course, in the public sector, it means people could die.
At this point, because the information asymmetry, because Beis Hillel, Beis Shammai, the classic argument, the Talmud on the issue is whether a bride on the wedding night, and Beis Hillel says all brides on the wedding night are beautiful, and Beis Shammai, God forbid, says she's ugly, you can't lie. To Machiavelli probably, which is probably more applicable in today's days, where it's saying the kind of best way to be a false leader is to actually be a tyrant, but portray yourself to the public as altruistic. And when you look at like YouTube and the platforms, that's basically, they're basically tyrants that portray themselves to be altruistic. They'll kick you off for their own reasons and aren't
Right,
honest or fair about it.
Their chest
Well,
about free speech. That's
yeah,
right.
and it's saying that's basic Machiavellian tactic that makes sense. And at this point, probably all politicians do it, from like the kosher hypocrisy, which just means like, I was hoping that having you on my channel would help your career, and like in reality I'm a nobody and I'm just faking it till I make it, but like I didn't mean any harm. Like I really believe in God and I really was trying to do a good and a service. I just portrayed myself to be better than I am, because I have a lot of belief in the good of God, or the good potential of humanity, which is, I would call kosher hypocrisy, maybe even recommended hypocrisy, where so like, no, you're not predestined to mediocrity. Everybody could have
You gotta prove yourself, right?
yeah, and fake it
But
till
you
you
cross
make
the
it.
line. I would cross, if I said to people, look, I think that my program is influential because I'm on these platforms and those platforms, maybe I might be trying to emphasize the positive, but there's a difference between that and if I flat out lied about numbers. Oh, I have these numbers of followers. I mean, either I have them or I don't. So, look, when you talk about like, is the bride beautiful? I mean, those are questions that are subjective. That's in the eye of the beholder. Someone's idea of beauty may be different than someone else's. But when it comes to like real lies and big lies and hypocrisies, it's our job as citizens. It's specifically, Doovid, yours and my job as media analysts doing this small broadcast, to try to ferret out truths and expose hypocrisies and lies. I mean, I'll give you an example. Earlier today, I do a TikTok every day, at least one. And I talked about how Elizabeth Warren, and I'm not going to go too deeply into this, my own senator, in 2019, published a blog along with three other senators, including Amy Klobuchar, and Ron Wyden from Oregon, all liberal Democrats, calling for an investigation of voting machines. They wanted, in fact, them all to be removed and replaced. They wanted to have a cyber wall put up to make sure that they didn't get hacked, or that they weren't going to be online at the time of the voting. And Elizabeth Warren went on to say, we need an election system that is as secure as Fort Knox, and went on to say several other things. Now, if you asked her about that now, she wouldn't own that. She says nothing now because Trump, there were questions that arose from the last election that she doesn't want to get into. And I view that as an example of hypocrisy, because now you have the Democrats being completely silent about a topic that they were quite vociferous about a couple of years ago. And
I'm trying to like, because if hypocrisy is really not that bad of a thing, you have to use a different expression for when you're talking about something that is, egregious. And Naftali Bennett was here in America. And if you say like, okay, we've argued like about Iran, if you say, how bad is Iran for America's interest? And you say, well, certainly for Israel's interest. And then for Israel's sake, if they could convince America to take action, but not for the sake of Israel, for our own sake. And, so America is going to be like, well, it's really not in our interest, but, we'll do it for you. And, if that's some sort of line of hypocrisy towards where the person is actually stealing, like possibly these stimulus bills or packages where they're claiming that they're
right,
giving
those are
money for the
crimes.
public good,
Yeah.
and really they're just stealing from the public coffers, and that's
Right,
more
those are outright crimes.
Machiavellian, and that's the point I'm making. Like,
Now, I have
in a
here-
Christian audience,
Mhm.
hypocrisy might seem like a pretty bad thing, and the same for a Jewish audience, maybe hypocrisy isn't that bad. It's like, okay, this person's a hypocrite.
Well, it is.
Well, like, so what? There's no crime to being a hypocrite. Everyone's a
Right,
hypocrite. And they say like, no, this person crossed the line. They're, Machiavellian bad hypocrite. There's actual damages to their hypocrisy. And then even if it's like the Israel-Iran issue, where if it's like, well, unfortunately, Israel's right that Iran is really bad for Israel, but they're not right how bad Iran is for America. And by trying to convince
Okay.
America's that Iran is really bad for America. Could that have damage to America as opposed to Israel just saying we really need your help on
Well,
this one,
that's making
even
an
though it
argument.
may not be in your best interest?
Well, that would be making an argument and maybe emphasizing certain points without necessarily, crossing a line. Now I have
Well,
here.
all of them will be
Wait a
on the
minute, David, hold
hypocrisy
on.
line. I
I
was like,
have here,
the same word
let me just
hypocrisy
get
is
into
used.
this, David, briefly. I have here on TikTok the recipe for Mexican matzo ball soup. 2 large carrots, 1 parsnip, 6 garlic cloves, a large onion, matzo meal. That sounds good.
I'm not sure what's Mexican about that.
I don't know. I'm not sure what's Mexican about that either. I mean, did you add a little chipotle? I don't know. But there it is. Okay. I mean, I'm getting these notes from TikTok. So, Doovid, what else is going on?
Well, holiday season's over, so it's back to work. Hopefully, as they in Yiddish to get the kvittel that we were inscribed for good things and blessings for everyone in the world. But we shall see. But the holiday season's over. I think Bennett came and there was the little thing with the squad. What was interesting is I didn't see any mainstream interviews with the Prime Minister of Israel. And if you look on YouTube, I think like AOC got more views than the Prime Minister of Israel. That's why I was saying that.
Well, they didn't really film, or they did not show on YouTube or even the media report his actual comments to Biden, which were filmed. And I'm not sure if that film has been suppressed. We know that these things
It's just not interesting to people. And
but it was very interesting because he completely took Biden to the woodshed. I mean, I did see this, and it was like, whoo, it was pretty intense. And
I'm saying
it's not been getting any kind of
I didn't see anything that had more than 100,000 views that include Naftali Bennett. I mean, he's young. He's not a well-known name. He's not really that personable.
He's still the Prime Minister
politics.
of Israel, and it deserved to get a certain number of.
Well, the policy got done. So say if Israel won on the policy agenda, okay, like the House ended up passing the Iron Dome funding. He made a point about like declaring victory or how well Israel did on COVID-19. I saw the Israeli papers aren't really so happy about that, and are saying Israel's questionably really not doing as well COVID-19 as it was said. But it looks like the UN Assembly. I'm not sure what's going to happen with Iran, but I think Israel was definitely diminished from the public conversation, probably due to the domestic issues. And I was just mentioning that AOC's comments on Israel got more views than anybody related to Israel, and so even though it didn't pass, that there's definitely a shift in the narrative. Like Alan Dershowitz says, see what's happening in the universities, and that's going to be indicative of what's happening decades from now. And certainly the narrative in universities has already shifted probably a decade ago. But
sort of an anti-Israel position.
Well, I'm saying that anti-Israel position is the norm in universities now, and it might take 20, 30 years for that to change in policy. Like if you're talking like the 60s and hippies or something like that, where in the 60s that was the norm in university. It took till the 80s till that became the norm in power structures, that anti-Israel has become the norm.
Yeah,
this is what Alan Dershowitz said.
That's fine.
I have it on my YouTube page. He said it. He said it when he came here to Detroit. But he's saying that anti-Israel has been the norm in universities.
It's been the norm in universities since 1948. And
he claims really only the last 5-10 years.
I don't think it's right.
I mean that shift, and he says that will be the shift in the power holes, decades after. And
there's usually a surge of anti-Israel agitprop in the universities whenever Israel's involved in a war. I mean, there was certainly in the 1970s after the Yom Kippur War. There was a huge, you went to with placards and protests and pro-Palestinian. That's not new. I think that's been there probably since day one. Now, if you say that it's making further inroads, I'm not sure I agree with that. I don't know. I don't have any hard data on that, but I don't think it's going to succeed in the bigger picture. I want to bring up something else here. And this, I'm going to dip my toe in a pretty controversial issue here for YouTube. So I want to be careful to avoid the actual corpus of the topic. I'm only going to talk about a particular aspect. And that is that there has been a good deal of bandying around about the vaccine passports as being compared to Jews in Nazi Germany wearing a yellow Jewish star. And by the way, was not unique to Nazi Germany. Nazi Germany revived a practice that actually goes back to the Middle Ages, when various kingdoms at various times required Jews to wear a particular article of clothing to publicly identify them as Jews. And in the Muslim world, it was done both to Jews and Christians. Jews would have to wear something yellow, Christians would have to wear something blue to publicly identify them as non-Muslims. So it's not unique to the Nazis. They simply revived it in the 1930s. And some people are comparing that to the vaccine passport now, that if you don't have the V card, you are seen as a separate citizen who doesn't have the same rights as everyone else, in that you can't go into restaurants and stores, you can't get on an airplane, you can't go on a train, and other things of that nature. Do you think that that is a comparison? And again, I'm not talking about the science of this here. I'm not getting into the vaccine. I've had the vaccine. This is not anti-vax. But do you think that there is any legitimate comparison there? And are people who are choosing not to get the vaccine being demonized beyond just simply being denied some of the basic functions that we need to get through society?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it's a great comparison, but certainly it's a pattern. It's a comparison, especially with the mandatory Holocaust education. Michigan, I know Slotkin and a lot of, I think Andy Levin in Michigan are want to pass national Holocaust education requirements. And if people have some sort of education, the basic structure of the pattern is pretty clear, where it's some sort of government totalitarian persecution of a minority. And, in Germany's the case of Jews, as opposed to America, you're looking at the case of people who voluntarily choose to not get vaccinated, that there's enough parallels. And then you're making some sort of outward symbol, say that you needed some sort of outward symbol that, me and Charles as Jews would need to make everyone else aware of that, God
Well, the
forbid,
outward symbol is the card,
that
the Vax card. I mean, that's.
Yeah, I mean, so the basic elements of the comparison to me seem semi valid, and then there's a lot of things that aren't valid. And then it's a question, well, people don't know that much about history. And if you have mandatory Holocaust education, where people, the main thing when people think of like totalitarian government oppression of minorities is Jews in the Holocaust. And that's one of the main purposes of the mandatory Holocaust education, is to teach people of the dangers of persecution of minorities by the government or by majority society, that it makes sense that large segments of the population, that's the pattern they're going to put together. Obviously, that could be problematic, especially the Jews. And you're saying like, okay, there's a lot of things that are dissimilar about it. But no, I mean, from a cognitive psychology, how people put together thoughts and recognize patterns, I think it's quite reasonable that people would put the pattern together that way, especially if they don't have a ton of historical education to know about all the intricacies and to say, what's similar and what's different. There's enough similarities that it seems reasonable to make that comparison. And then what's the purpose of mandatory Holocaust education if you're not allowing people to be free thinking, that, saying, okay, you have to learn about the Holocaust, but you could only understand the Holocaust for the lessons that you're taught. You're not allowed to use your mind to try to think about the lessons of the Holocaust on your own. And then what happens if, the tens of millions of people across America are being educated about the Holocaust? This is the parallel that they put together.
Well, first of all, I mean, I will just say that I do think that it is a valid parallel. Not literally in that there's no gas chambers for people who aren't vaccinated. There's no concentration camps, at least not yet, although I believe there are in Australia. Again, I want to be careful here because a lot of the stuff is censored. And I have certain opinions about people being forced to undergo a medical procedure by law, which is something that is against not only the HIPAA laws as they stand in this country, but they're actually against the Nuremberg Code that came out of Nazi Germany after the defeat of Hitler. And that, to me, is a little bit of a parallel that I'm not going to go into any further. Let's just drop it right there. Because again, this is a censored network. And I have a few things I might want to say about that, but this ain't the right venue.
I mean, I assume you're also be opposed to mandatory Holocaust education, as I'm generally opposed to mandatory anything, although it's an important thing. And like I talk about it constantly.
You know something, I don't know if I'm against mandatory.
But what do you expect
Holocaust
people to take
education
out of it? If you're taking people that don't know a lot about history and you're saying that this is something they need to know, of course, they're going to draw that comparison to basically any time of some sort of oppression if they feel impressed.
Yeah. Well, I mean, look, I don't know if I'm against mandatory Holocaust training as long as it's something that is decided by a local school board, not statewide, certainly not nationally. But if a local school board made up of elected officials sent there by parents want to have a form of Holocaust education in their schools, then they have a right to decide that by vote. That's
I think
fine.
already 15 states, including Michigan, I don't know about Boston, already have statewide
Okay.
mandatory, and there's a push to have it on the federal level.
I know, and I'm not comfortable with it on a federal level, and I'm not sure I'm comfortable with it on a state level, but I tend to view education generally as something that ought to be under the control of local communities and local school boards. So in that sense, I'm not being hypocritical, if we must, because I, across the board, believe in the right of the local school board to decide educational questions such as Holocaust education or critical theory or anything else. Those are local questions. Now, having said that, I think that Holocaust education itself is beneficial, not only in that it gets into the history of the actual Holocaust of the Nazi Holocaust, which I think is important, but also if it examines, and I think you made reference to this, Doovid, if it examines some of the political and philosophical orientation that led to the Holocaust. And I would say that if they open the lens up a little bit on that one, you would have to examine the socialistic nature of Nazism and whether or not the Nazis were imitating the Bolsheviks to the degree that they were, and I would argue that they were. I actually wrote a book on this topic called Was Hitler a Leftist? And that book sells fairly well.
They don't let people be critical thinking and say that you're going to teach people about it and allow people to draw their own conclusion. But it's really the conclusion, the mandatory Holocaust education, which is almost largely pushed by leftists, it's the conclusion, and the conclusion is largely the danger of racism and the necessity of multicultural society. So it's like you can't draw your own conclusion, and even if it's like the lesson is some sort of Second Amendment, and God forbid that's why we need the Second Amendment, or that's why we have to worry about the government being too big. That generally you're not allowed to draw those own conclusions. The only conclusion that you're supposed to draw is the leftist pro multicultural.
Well, that's the problem with it. I mean, it has a leftist orientation, and it comes up with leftist conclusions. It's used as like a lot. It's
not thinking about critical issues. It's more demagoguery,
propaganda, just in the way that race education has been taken over by critical race theory, which is a form of cultural Marxism. It has nothing to do with actually looking at racial division and racial conflict and how to solve it. And I mean, I'll give you one local example here in Boston. This is so minor, but nevertheless, it may be anecdotal, but there is a big education group in this state that does offer Holocaust education. I'm not going to mention the name of it, but it is the biggest one in Massachusetts, and it's very leftist. And I detected something, actually somebody I know, a young student, detected something in their presentation, in that they talked about Sophie Scholl and her brother Hans Scholl. They were German Nazis, young people, teenagers, who objected to the Nazi regime for reasons that, because of its immorality and because of its anti-Semitism and other reasons. And they were both brought in and forced to the Nazis tried to get them to recant. They refused to, and they were both executed. I don't know if you know the story. The Rose, what do they call it? The Rose Movement. It was a movement of young people in Nazi Germany who opposed the regime. And they did so because they were devout Christians. They were devout Lutherans, it so happens. And that's what led them to this. They said, this is unchristian, it's immoral, it's evil. And the way this Holocaust group in Boston portrays this is that they edit out the part about their Christianity, and instead they talk about it as if they were communists. I'm just saying that this is how an ideological group can pervert what actually happened in the Holocaust and use it to their own political agenda, which is not necessarily in sync with what happened.
I mean, so related how we got into this topic. So Israel is actually, has been using the Green Pass system for quite a while now. And I think maybe effective already or very soon is the booster shot that the Green Pass is going to expire.
Let's not talk about it. Yeah,
let's not
talk. I don't want to talk about
have...
it with shots. I mean, the Israel is though using the passport system. It's interesting. Just as a note on that, and again,
and now it's the booster is included in that.
Yeah, I don't want to talk about boosters. I have no position on it. Okay.
Okay. Well, I'm saying that in Israel you would not be able to go to public events anymore if you haven't got your booster.
Alex, Alexjones. We can't even mention his name on this station. And if I get on the other station, believe me, I'm going to be having him on. I'll have all those people. But putting that aside, he talked about the vaccine passport in 2020 at the very beginning of the pandemic, and he was viciously criticized for engaging in conspiracy theories. He also talked about the Wuhan lab. I'm not going to go into that either. Now generally accepted what he had to say by most scientists. And the vaccine passports have now come about. I mean, that's now becoming mandatory and it's becoming the law. And so, sometimes when you hear the establishment starts screaming about conspiracy theories, by the way, a third one, and again, I'm not going to get into details.
We're talking about Israel because Bennett is like a right-wing extremist, and he's also bragging about Israel's vaccine passport system.
Yeah, okay. Well, this goes left or right. It doesn't matter. But the third point,
I mean, it's interesting that was one of the things he was taking credit for. And then in Israel, the doctors were all like, "You can't. You're just a politician. It was the doctors. Give us credit." And then during Bennett's UN speech, he was like, "No, it's the politicians. It's the head of states, not the doctors." But like ironically, as a right wing, Israel, one of these diversions of being right wing in America as opposed to Israel is that Israel is a military state. People generally have high trust in the government and in the military as opposed to the U.S. So Bennett, as a right winger in Israel, is bragging about implementing these things.
Right. I mean, again, this is just an authoritarian thing. But the third conspiracy theory that I want to bring up, and I'm going to be real careful on this one, is that there is now the Merck pharmaceutical company is conducting field tests on a drug that can be taken orally, that apparently they're hoping is effective in curing the COVID-19 virus. And that the components of this drug basically are the same as a drug that has been attacked, we're not mentioning names, as being, used for animals and this sort of thing. And that has been denounced by the establishment as a conspiracy theory and mocked and ridiculed. And I guess that all I can say is that if eventually Merck does get FDA approval for this drug and it does start to be used, it brings into question, blood on people's hands, because if it could have been used for years, then what does that say? Anyways, I don't want to say
It's
more.
just like 1984. The purpose is controlling people, and they'll just make you believe in anything and force you to believe it. And once that crumbles, will be the next thing.
Then they come
And
up
the
with
purpose is more
yeah.
control, and it's probably going to continue, and it's probably going to keep on getting worse. I mean, I don't know if you wanted to mention, the Democrats falling apart and the stimulus package and
What's
the
going on
debt
with
and the
that?
debt ceiling,
Yeah.
and I'm more straight.
$3.5 trillion in spending on social issues.
Yeah, I'm pretty
A little bit for
fiscally conservative.
infrastructure.
Like, just please balance the budget.
Yeah, that's right.
But yeah, I mean, like the media is trying to create some sort of scare speech in order to get these stimulus package.
I don't think it's going to work. They're going to try to blame Republicans, and I don't think it's going to work. Because the Democrats have come up with this package that's going to put a lien on all of us for a generation. I mean, we're talking about trillions of dollars. It's kind of like, it's based on the economic theories of Thomas Piketty in his book Capital. He's a French socialist.
I have those books.
Yeah, but his basic theory is the government can just continue to spend and spend and spend indefinitely, because they're never going to have to pay it back anyway, and that when they run out of money, just spend some more, and that there's no end to it. And it's sort of like John Maynard Keynes on crack. It's like we can just spend, and it kind of reminds me, frankly, on a medical side of the vaccine, in that, and again, I'm not going to go too far here, but Israel is saying that you need a booster every 5 months because it wears off. We'll be getting the booster for the rest of our lives. And who knows what the long-term effect might be. Again, I don't want to get into it too far, but it's this whole philosophy that, you just keep throwing stuff at it over and over and over again, and there will never be any consequence. It runs against common sense and human nature. There are consequences to everything that we do. And if the government is going to spend $3.5 trillion on basically handouts to wealthy special interest friends and foreign dictators, and maybe throw a little bit for roads and bridges, there are going to be consequences to that in terms of the value of the dollar to working men and women.
Yeah, everyone's incompetent. I mean, the crisis of competency, just where you're not going to be able to pay anybody to actually get the job done. So they'll have money, they'll throw it at people, but none of those people are actually going to be able to fix the infrastructure. So it's just going to toss us trillions of dollars further in debt.
They'll just keep. It's like what happened in the Soviet
How connected
Union.
is this to China and like the
Evergreen
evergreen company that's going out of
the
business?
money wasn't worth anything after a while. People were paid money they didn't buy. That's what happened in Weimar Germany before Hitler.
When the Democrats are hyping up anti-Chinese rhetoric, and the Biden administration and the big Chinese development company Everclear is possibly going bankrupt, and I believe the Chinese are the biggest holders of our debt, and to a certain extent we are really borrowing money from China to do this. And
that's what they'll do. They'll bond debt, and it'll be purchased.
And then we're attacking the people that are lending us the money. Like,
right.
Even the Biden administration
the bonds.
is attacking is going heavy on attacking China, and that's why the reality is that our best years as the nation are probably behind us, and it's unlikely that they're to sell somebody like the hypocrisy. I have hope that our best days are ahead of us, but that hope is going to collectively need us to borrow $10 trillion and use it on shady projects that don't benefit everybody. There's no longer kosher hypocrisy, but versus just saying kosher hypocrisy of Trump is like, I'm a cheerleader for the nation. Everything tells me our best days are behind us, but I'm still going to be a cheerleader and pretend like our best days are ahead of us.
Well, first of all, Doovid, I don't think it's going to happen. I don't think they're going to get that kind of spending. But secondly, I believe that we are in the age of Trump, even though Trump has been removed from office. And people are seeing, and the polls indicate this, that this present regime has failed in every front. They have failed in terms of the the defeat and the total loss in Afghanistan, where you have billions of dollars in American hardware and military materiel falling into the hands of our enemies, and Americans left behind, and Afghanistani friends left behind for this horrible regime, while other Afghans were brought out. You have the collapse of the southern border and the importation of untold hundreds of thousands of illegal immigrants. You have the collapse of the economy. The dollar is being devalued. It's people are starting to feel it, both at the gas pump, even at stores and at restaurants and at buying purchasing power. And you have the implementation in our culture and in our schools and in our corporations of this racist critical theory agenda. These are failures of our country on all four levels. We are paying the price of the election and however that came about. And
I argue austerity is coming. Probably even with Trump, we probably would have had austerities coming. I'd even said it jokingly, although now thinking about it, it's pretty likely to happen. We're going to have President Kamala Harris overseeing austerities, and she's probably not going to give a crap. She's probably going to hit us really hard with austerities, and it's probably going to be wealth. They're going to attempted wealth redistribution with severe austerity.
They'll keep spending.
I mean, because we need austerity, because we're the fiscally that austerity is.
They'll just keep spending, and they'll tax. And by the way, I'm not against the idea of taxing some.
I'm more fiscally conservative. I'm saying you can't run these deficits, huge deficits, and keep raising the debt ceiling forever. Austerity is a given. It was a given 10 years. When Trump came in, he should have done austerities, and Trump ran up the deficit. Now it's you reached a point where we might not have credit anymore. We may be in a situation like Europe was after 2008.
I mean,
and we're going to have austerities across America.
Repair some of the problems that had been left to him, like the collapse of the defense. But now they're just spending it on their friends. They're giving it to. I mean, you should see some of the things in this bill that are. I mean, people are just, getting massages here, and most of these people are rich. Anyway,
they're just raiding what's ever left in the coffers, and basically is saying America's done, and the best you can do is just raid the coffers for yourself before it's over.
They're not going to win because the truth will prevail. Doovid, what do you have coming up on your show?
I might have a debate next week or the week after on in this New Zealand show, Theology Unleashed. I think your friends on Facebook, like Arjun, on evidence for the soul, where I will be presenting the argument for the soul, and I'll probably focus more on the Greeks and the empirical, to say that the controller, just the fact that there's a Charles that that's not your body, so to say, that whatever it is that controls your body and thinks about these ideas empirically is not you. It can't be you. It has to be your soul. And then maybe some of the classical arguments or the implications of having a soul or not on various moral, ethical issues. I'm looking forward to that. The week in review, I've been moving more towards consciousness, spiritual related topics. So I still enjoy discussing, the weekly occurrences or Israel politics from a Jewish perspective. But I'm going to be moving more into consciousness studies, and hopefully going to be having regular debates on these more timeless theological, epistemological issues than on current things. And I think about the great thinkers. If you read about them, certainly our Jewish thinkers like Maimonides, Nachmanides, a lot of them, they went through the war. They had to leave governments that collapsed. God forbid, a lot of them had large portions of their family wiped out, and they still spent regular time thinking about these timeless theological issues and publishing on them. And even people like Descartes
they had strong inner core. They had strong. It's like what Viktor Frankl talked about in Man's Search for Meaning. He survived in Nazi death camps, and he was a psychologist in Vienna.
Even
And
scientists that came up with great theories.
he did the logotherapy, and he talked about how his sense of his inner life saved him. He had like a strong sense of meaning. And then he talks about some of the particulars that he did to help him survive, which is very interesting. I really recommend his book. But, these people had a strong inner life. They were not empty suits. They had things going on. I think of Natan Sharansky, who spent 30 years in the Russian Gulag, and how he survived through this very strong inner core that could not be imprisoned. They can imprison the body, but they couldn't imprison the soul. Anyway, Doovid, listen, thanks as always for joining me for the excellent talk.
Okay, great. Look forward to your updates on what's going on, and I'll see you next week.
All right, Doovid.